The morning of July 11, 1944, broke gray and humid over the hedgerow country south of St. Lo. Sergeant William Knudsen of the 3rd Armored Division pressed his face against the periscope of his M4 Sherman tank, scanning the Norman countryside through a film of condensation that fogged the optics. The hedgerows rose like ancient walls on either side of the sunken lane, their tangled roots and branches forming barriers that had stood for centuries, dividing this land into 1,000 tiny battlefields. Each field was a potential killing ground. Each hedgerow could hide a German 88mm anti-tank gun. Each corner could conceal a Panther tank waiting with its long barrel trained on the exact spot where American armor would appear. Knudsen's Sherman tank, serial number 304-8217, had rolled off the production line at the Detroit Tank Arsenal just 4 months earlier. The Chrysler Corporation had built it in 11 hours, part of the 49,000 Sherman tanks that would pour from American factories during the war. The tank weighed 33 tons, carried a 75mm gun, and could reach speeds of 25 miles per hour on good roads. Its armor was 2.5 inches thick at its strongest point. The crew had named her Betty Lou, after Knudsen's girl back in Iowa, painting the name in white letters on the turret beside a cartoon of a pin-up girl that the driver, Private Angelo Russo from Brooklyn, had copied from a magazine. Betty Lou was one of 66 Sherman tanks in the 32nd Armored Regiment, part of the 3rd Armored Division's Combat Command A, and she had already survived 17 days of combat since landing at Omaha Beach. But survival in a Sherman tank was a matter of luck more than anything else. The crews called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised they would light first time, every time. When a German 88mm shell penetrated a Sherman's armor, the tank would burst into flames within seconds. The ammunition stored in the sponsons would cook off, sending jets of fire through the crew compartment. The gasoline engine, which the British had wisely replaced with diesel in their versions, would turn the entire vehicle into a crematorium. Tank crews had perhaps 15 seconds to escape before the Sherman became their tomb. Most never made it out. The 3rd Armored Division had learned these harsh truths in the 3 weeks since D-Day. They had lost 41 Sherman tanks in the first week alone, most to German anti-tank guns hidden in the hedgerows. The 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. The German Panther tank, with its high-velocity 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman at even greater ranges, while the Sherman's gun could only penetrate a Panther's armor at point-blank range, and then only from the side or rear. The mathematics of tank warfare in Normandy were brutally simple. It took 5 Sherman tanks to destroy 1 Panther, and the first 4 Shermans would burn. Knudsen had seen his first burning Sherman tank on June 29th, near the village of Villiers-Fossard. The crew of 5 had been caught by a hidden 88mm gun as they crested a small rise. The armor-piercing shell had entered through the lower glassy plate and detonated the ammunition. The turret had blown completely off, landing 20 feet away in a wheat field. When Knudsen's platoon reached the wreck 6 hours later, they found the driver still in his seat, his hands fused to the steering levers. The loader's body was scattered in pieces across the tank's interior. The tank commander, gunner, and assistant driver had managed to bail out but had been cut down by German machine gun fire as they ran. Their bodies lay in the wheat, their tanker's coveralls still smoldering. That night, Knudsen had written to Betty Lou but couldn't find the words to describe what he had seen. How could he explain to a girl who worked at the telephone exchange in Des Moines that he commanded a death trap? That every time they rolled into combat, the odds said that 4 out of 5 Sherman tanks wouldn't come back? That the tank named after her was more likely to become his funeral pyre than to carry him home? He wrote instead about the French countryside, about the apple orchards and stone farmhouses, about anything except the burning Sherman tanks that haunted his dreams. The 32nd Armored Regiment had spent July 10th in an assembly area near Saint-Jean-de-Day, conducting maintenance on their Sherman tanks and receiving replacements for the crews lost in the previous week's fighting. The replacement crews were green kids, most of them barely out of training at Fort Knox. They had never seen a Tiger tank except in recognition charts. They had never smelled burning flesh or heard the screams of men trapped in burning Sherman tanks. They still believed what they had been taught in training, that American tanks were the best in the world, that American technology and industrial might would overwhelm the Germans, that the Sherman tank was a war-winning weapon. Private First Class Tommy Morrison was one of those replacements. 19 years old, from a farm outside Topeka, he had arrived that morning as the new assistant driver for Knudsen's Sherman. Morrison had trained on Sherman tanks at Fort Knox for 12 weeks, learning to load the 75mm gun in under 4 seconds, to clear jams in the coaxial machine gun, to operate the radio to escape from a burning tank. But training couldn't prepare him for the reality of armored combat in the hedgerow country of Normandy. Training couldn't prepare him for the sound a German 88mm shell made when it punched through armor plate, a sound like a giant bell being struck with a sledgehammer. Training couldn't prepare him for the sight of a Sherman tank brewing up, its crew screaming inside as the flames consumed them. On that morning of July 11th, the 3rd Armored Division received orders to attack toward the town of Panther as part of the preliminary operations for what would become Operation Cobra, the massive offensive designed to break out of the Normandy beachhead. The 32nd Armored Regiment would lead the assault, with the 33rd Armored Regiment in support. Infantry from the 1st Infantry Division would follow to clear the hedgerows of German anti-tank teams. Artillery from the 54th Armored Field Artillery Battalion would provide preparatory fires. It was a textbook combined arms operation, the kind that had been practiced endlessly in Louisiana maneuvers before D-Day. But the hedgerow country of Normandy bore no resemblance to the training grounds of Louisiana. Each hedgerow was a fortress, its earthen base 3 to 4 feet thick, topped with centuries of root growth that could stop a Sherman tank cold. The Germans had turned these natural obstacles into a defensive masterwork. They had dug positions for their 88mm anti-tank guns at the corners of fields, where they could fire down the length of the hedgerows. They had placed Panther and Tiger tanks in hull-down positions behind the hedgerows, with only their turrets exposed. They had sown the gaps in the hedgerows with Teller anti-tank mines and positioned Panzerfaust teams in spider holes to ambush any Sherman that tried to break through. The attack began at 0600 hours with a 30-minute artillery barrage. The 54th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired over 2,000 rounds of 105mm high explosive into the German positions around Panther. The shells burst in the apple orchards and pastures, sending up fountains of earth and shattered trees. But the German positions, dug deep into the reverse slopes of the hedgerows, survived largely intact. When the barrage lifted and the Sherman tanks of the 32nd Armored Regiment rolled forward, the Germans were waiting. Knudsen's platoon of 5 Sherman tanks advanced in a wedge formation down a sunken lane toward their first objective, a crossroads marked on their maps as Point 117. The hedgerows rose 15 feet on either side of the lane, their overgrown branches forming a green tunnel that blocked out the morning sun. The Sherman tanks moved in first gear, their engines roaring, tracks grinding against the ancient stones of the roadbed. Through his periscope, Knudsen could see perhaps 50 yards ahead before the lane curved out of sight. Any one of those curves could hide a German anti-tank gun. Any gap in the hedgerow could conceal a Panzerfaust team. The first Sherman tank to die that morning was Lieutenant Patterson's, the platoon leader's tank. As Patterson's Sherman rounded a curve in the lane 200 yards ahead of Knudsen's position, a German 88mm anti-tank gun fired from a concealed position in the hedgerow. The armor-piercing shell struck the Sherman's turret ring, the weakest point in the tank's armor. The shell penetrated completely, decapitating the gunner and sending fragments through the crew compartment. The Sherman lurched to a stop, blocking the lane. Within seconds, flames began pouring from the turret hatches as the ammunition cooked off. Knudsen saw Patterson try to climb out of the commander's hatch, his clothes on fire, before a second 88mm shell struck the Sherman's hull and the entire tank exploded. The remaining 4 Sherman tanks in the platoon were trapped in the sunken lane. They couldn't reverse quickly enough to escape, couldn't traverse their turrets far enough to engage the hidden 88mm gun, couldn't climb the steep banks of the hedgerows. They were sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, and the German gunners knew it. The second 88mm shell struck the Sherman directly behind Patterson's tank, penetrating the thin side armor and detonating the fuel tanks. The crew never had a chance. The Sherman became a pillar of fire, its burning gasoline flowing down the lane like a river of flame. Knudsen screamed into his throat microphone for his driver to reverse, but Russo was already throwing the Sherman into gear. The 33-ton tank lurched backward, tracks spinning on the wet stones. Behind them, the two remaining Sherman tanks in the platoon were also trying to reverse, their engines screaming at maximum revolutions. But the lane was too narrow for all three tanks to reverse simultaneously. They collided with each other, tracks tangling, armor plates grinding together with a sound like the world's largest car crash. A German Panzerfaust team emerged from a concealed position in the hedgerow 20 yards from Knudsen's trapped Sherman. The Panzerfaust was a simple weapon, a shaped charge warhead on a disposable tube, but at close range it could penetrate 4 inches of armor. The German soldier raised the Panzerfaust to his shoulder, aiming at the thin side armor of Knudsen's Sherman. Morrison, the new assistant driver, saw him through his periscope and screamed a warning. Russo slammed the Sherman forward, trying to run the German down, but the tank was still tangled with the Sherman behind it. The German fired. The Panzerfaust warhead struck the Sherman's hull just behind the driver's position. The shaped charge jet punched through the armor like a white-hot needle, spraying molten metal through the crew compartment. Private James Wilson, the loader, took the full force of the jet in his chest. He was dead before his body hit the floor of the tank. Shrapnel from the penetration wounded Morrison in the shoulder and face, blood streaming down into his eyes. The Sherman's engine compartment burst into flames. Knudsen didn't remember giving the order to abandon tank. Training took over, the drill they had practiced 100 times at Fort Knox. The gunner, Corporal Paul Kowalski from Chicago, was already pushing open his hatch. Morrison, despite his wounds, was helping Russo unlatch the driver's hatch. Knudsen grabbed the .45 caliber pistol from its holster beside his seat and pushed open the commander's hatch. The smell of burning gasoline filled his nostrils. He had perhaps 10 seconds before the ammunition cooked off. Kowalski was out first, rolling off the turret and dropping into the mud of the lane. A burst of German machine gun fire from somewhere in the hedgerows caught him before he could find cover. The bullets punched through his body, spinning him around like a rag doll. He fell face first into a puddle of burning gasoline from one of the destroyed Sherman tanks and didn't move again. Russo was halfway out of the driver's hatch when the Sherman's ammunition began to cook off. The first round to detonate was a 75mm high-explosive shell, which blew the loader's hatch completely off and sent a jet of flame 20 feet into the air. The concussion threw Russo clear of the tank, unconscious but alive. Knudsen pulled Morrison through the assistant driver's hatch just as the remaining ammunition began to detonate in a chain reaction of explosions. Each 75mm shell that cooked off sent fragments screaming through the air, ricocheting off the walls of the sunken lane like angry hornets. Knudsen dragged Morrison into a shallow ditch at the base of the hedgerow, pressing their bodies into the mud as their Sherman tank tore itself apart above them. Betty Lou was dying, and with her died any illusions Knudsen had about American technical superiority. The destruction of Knudsen's platoon took less than 4 minutes. 5 Sherman tanks and 25 men had entered that sunken lane. 1 damaged Sherman and 7 wounded men crawled out. The Germans hadn't even revealed their main defensive positions. The 88mm gun that had destroyed the platoon was merely an outpost, a single anti-tank gun with a crew of 5 men. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, the German Panther tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich were waiting, their long 75mm guns trained on the approaches to Panther. All along the front of the 3rd Armored Division's attack, similar scenes were playing out. Sherman tanks were dying in the hedgerows, caught by hidden 88mm guns, ambushed by Panzerfaust teams, destroyed by Panther tanks they never even saw. By noon on July 11th, the 32nd Armored Regiment had lost 18 Sherman tanks and over 90 men. They had advanced less than 500 yards. The attack was called off, and the surviving tanks pulled back to their start line to regroup and receive replacements. That night, in a replacement depot near Isigny, Knudsen met the crew that would take over a new Sherman tank to replace Betty Lou. They were 5 kids fresh from the States, their uniforms still creased from the factory, their faces unmarked by the horror of armored combat. The tank commander was a 2nd lieutenant named David Harper, 22 years old, from a small town in Ohio. He had graduated from officer candidate school at Fort Knox just 6 weeks earlier. He showed Knudsen a picture of his wife, married just before he shipped out, and talked excitedly about the Great Crusade to liberate Europe. Knudsen wanted to tell Harper the truth. He wanted to tell him that the Sherman tank was a death trap, that the Germans called them Tommy Cookers after the British troops who died in them, that the life expectancy of a Sherman tank crew in combat was measured in minutes, not hours. He wanted to tell him about Patterson's tank brewing up, about Kowalski dying in a puddle of burning gasoline, about the sound men made when they burned alive inside a Sherman tank. But he didn't. What was the point? Harper would learn the truth soon enough, probably tomorrow when the 3rd Armored Division resumed its attack toward Panther. The next morning, July 12th, brought more of the same slaughter. The 32nd Armored Regiment attacked again at dawn, this time with infantry support from the 1st Infantry Division. The infantry were supposed to clear the hedgerows of German anti-tank teams, but the hedgerow country made coordination between tanks and infantry nearly impossible. The Sherman tanks advanced down the sunken lanes while the infantry struggled through the hedgerows, trying to keep pace. But the hedgerows were a maze, each field a separate battlefield, and units quickly lost contact with each other. Lieutenant Harper's brand-new Sherman tank lasted exactly 17 minutes in combat. His platoon was advancing through an apple orchard when they encountered their first German tank, a Panther from the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The Panther was in a perfect position, hull down behind a stone wall with only its turret exposed. Harper's gunner fired first, the 75mm shell striking the Panther's turret face and bouncing off harmlessly. The German tank commander didn't even flinch. The Panther's long 75mm gun swiveled slightly, aimed and fired. The high-velocity armor-piercing shell punched through Harper's Sherman like it was made of cardboard. The tank burst into flames instantly, the ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that could be heard a mile away. Harper and his entire crew died in their tank, their first and last combat action of the war. The mathematics of the battle were relentless and unforgiving. For every German tank destroyed, the 3rd Armored Division was losing 4 or 5 Sherman tanks. For every mile of ground gained, they were paying in blood and burning metal. The replacement system couldn't keep pace with the losses. New Sherman tanks were arriving from England daily, shipped across the Channel and driven straight into combat. But trained crews were becoming scarce. Men who had been cooks or clerks a week earlier were being pressed into service as tank crewmen, given a few hours of instruction, and sent into battle. By July 15th, after 5 days of brutal fighting, the 3rd Armored Division had advanced just 3 miles toward Panther. They had lost 73 Sherman tanks and over 400 men. The hedgerow country had become a graveyard of American armor, the burned-out hulls of Sherman tanks littering every lane and field. The French civilians who emerged from their cellars after the fighting passed found a landscape of destruction that reminded them of the battlefields of the First World War. Entire orchards had been reduced to splintered stumps. Ancient hedgerows that had stood since medieval times had been blown apart by artillery. And everywhere were the burned-out Sherman tanks, their guns pointing at odd angles, their armor blackened by fire, their crews buried in hasty graves beside the lanes where they died. The German defenders had paid a price too. The 2nd SS Panzer Division had lost 11 Panther tanks and 6 Tiger tanks in the fighting around Panther. But they could afford these losses better than the Americans. A single Panther tank was worth 5 Sherman tanks in combat power, and the Germans were fighting on the defensive, able to choose their positions and maximize their advantages. They had turned the hedgerow country into a fortress, and they were making the Americans pay for every yard of ground. On the night of July 15th, Knudsen found himself in command of a composite platoon made up of survivors from various units. He had 3 Sherman tanks under his command, all damaged but still operational. His own tank was a replacement for Betty Lou, a Sherman with a 76mm gun that was supposed to be able to penetrate German armor better than the standard 75mm. The crew was a mixed bag of survivors. Russo had recovered from his concussion and was driving again. Morrison had returned from the aid station with his shoulder bandaged and was serving as loader. The gunner was a replacement named Stevens who had been a cook until 3 days ago, and the assistant driver was a kid named Johnson who had arrived in France just that morning. They were positioned in a defensive line along a hedgerow north of Panther, waiting for orders for the next day's attack. The Germans were probing their positions with patrols, and occasional mortar rounds dropped into the American lines. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of German tanks moving into position for a counterattack. Everyone knew that the 2nd SS Panzer Division still had at least 30 operational Panther tanks and a dozen Tiger tanks in reserve. If the Germans attacked in force, the thin line of damaged Sherman tanks wouldn't be able to stop them. Morrison, despite being just 19 years old and wounded, had aged years in the past 5 days. He sat on the back deck of the Sherman, smoking a cigarette with his good hand, staring at the burning wreckage of a Sherman tank in the field ahead of them. It had been destroyed that afternoon, hit by a Panther at long range. The crew hadn't made it out. Morrison had helped bury what was left of them, scooping up the charred fragments with a shovel and placing them in a mattress cover that would serve as a body bag. "Sergeant," Morrison said quietly, "why don't we have better tanks? I mean, we can build more tanks than anyone, right? We built 49,000 Shermans. Why didn't we build better ones?" Knudsen didn't have an answer that would satisfy Morrison or himself. The truth was that the Sherman tank had been designed in 1940, when the largest German tank was the Panzer III with its 37mm gun. The Sherman had been revolutionary then, combining mobility, reliability, and firepower in a package that could be mass-produced. But the Germans had moved on to bigger and better tanks, the Panthers and Tigers with their thick armor and high-velocity guns, while the Americans had kept producing the same basic Sherman design. There had been attempts to build better American tanks. The M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun was in development, but it wouldn't reach the battlefield until the war was almost over. "We build what we can ship," Knudsen finally answered. "A Sherman weighs 33 tons. Pershing weighs 46 tons. We can fit more Shermans on a ship, more Shermans on a landing craft, more Shermans on the roads. It's all about logistics, kid. We're fighting this war 3,000 miles from home. Everything has to come across the Atlantic, then across the Channel." The generals figured it was better to have lots of adequate tanks than a few excellent ones. "Adequate," Morrison repeated bitterly. "Tell that to Lieutenant Harper's crew. Tell that to Patterson and Kowalski and all the others burning in their adequate tanks." There was nothing Knudsen could say to that. Morrison was right. The Sherman tank was adequate for many things. It was reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in vast numbers. But it was not adequate for fighting German Panthers and Tigers. It was not adequate for keeping its crews alive. Every Sherman tank crew in Normandy knew they were rolling into battle in inferior machines, that their survival depended more on luck than skill, that their tanks would burn when hit. They had even developed a gallows humor about it, joking that the best thing about the Sherman was that it burned so quickly you didn't suffer long. The German counterattack came at dawn on July 16th. 24 Panther tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, supported by a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers, smashed into the American lines north of Panther. The Panthers came out of the morning mist like prehistoric monsters, their long guns swiveling to find targets, their thick frontal armor impervious to American fire. The first warning Knudsen had was the sound of high-velocity guns firing, that distinctive crack that meant German tanks were attacking. Through his periscope, Knudsen saw them coming across the fields, Panthers advancing in perfect formation, their guns firing on the move. A Sherman tank to his left took a direct hit and exploded, the turret flying off like a champagne cork. Another Sherman tried to reverse out of position but exposed its thin side armor and was destroyed by a single shot. The American line was disintegrating, Sherman tanks dying one after another, their burning hulls marking the German advance. Knudsen ordered Stevens to engage the nearest Panther, now just 400 yards away. The 76mm gun fired, the armor-piercing shell striking the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheting into the sky. The German tank didn't even slow down. Its turret traversed slightly, the long gun aimed directly at Knudsen's Sherman. This was it, Knudsen thought. This was how it ended, sitting in a metal coffin waiting for the shell that would turn them all into charred meat. But the shell never came. From somewhere behind the American lines, a new sound entered the battle. the roar of aircraft engines. P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group came in low over the hedgerows, their wings heavy with rockets and bombs. The flight leader had been vectored onto the German attack by a forward air controller, and his 4 aircraft had arrived just as the German spearhead was in the open, exposed and vulnerable to air attack. The first P-47 dove on the lead Panther, firing 8 5-inch rockets in a single salvo. The rockets struck the Panther's thin top armor, penetrating into the crew compartment and detonating the ammunition. The Panther exploded from within, its turret flying 50 feet into the air. The second P-47 dropped 2 500-pound bombs on a cluster of Panthers, the explosions flipping one tank completely over and setting 2 others on fire. The German attack faltered, the Panthers seeking cover in the hedgerows, their crews abandoning tanks that had been damaged by the airstrikes. Within minutes, the tide of battle had turned. The Panthers that had seemed invincible moments before were now burning wrecks. The Panzer Grenadiers were fleeing back across the fields, pursued by American machine gun fire. The P-47s made another pass, strafing the retreating Germans with their 850 caliber machine guns, turning the orderly withdrawal into a rout. The German counterattack had been broken by air power, the one advantage the Americans possessed in overwhelming abundance. As the smoke cleared, Knudsen counted the cost. His platoon had lost 1 more Sherman tank, but they had survived. Across the battlefield, 12 German Panthers were burning, destroyed not by American tanks but by American aircraft. It was a lesson that would be repeated throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. The Sherman tank might be inferior to German armor, but American air superiority could tip the balance. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs were the equalizers, the guardian angels of the American armored divisions. The breakthrough finally came on July 25th with the launch of Operation Cobra. After 2 weeks of bitter fighting in the hedgerows, the American command had finally developed tactics to break the deadlock. Engineers had welded steel prongs to the front of Sherman tanks, creating rhino tanks that could punch through hedgerows instead of having to find gaps. The artillery had developed new techniques for coordinating fires with advancing armor. Most importantly, the Army Air Forces had concentrated the greatest display of tactical air power in history. On the morning of July 25th, over 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force carpeted the German positions south of St. Lo with 4,000 tons of bombs. The ground shook like an earthquake, and the concussion could be felt 20 miles away. Entire German units simply ceased to exist, obliterated by the concentrated bombing. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best German armored units in Normandy, lost 70% of its tanks and vehicles in the bombing. When the 3rd Armored Division rolled forward after the bombing, they found a moonscape of craters and destroyed equipment. German soldiers wandered in shock, their eardrums burst, blood running from their noses and ears. But even Operation Cobra came at a cost. Some of the American bombs fell short, hitting the 30th Infantry Division and killing over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. The Sherman tanks advancing through the bomb-cratered landscape found that while many German positions had been destroyed, others had survived. Hidden 88mm guns still claimed their toll of burning tanks. Panther tanks that had survived the bombing still outmatched the Shermans in tank-versus-tank combat. Knudsen's tank was one of the first through the breach created by Operation Cobra. They advanced 5 miles on the first day, more ground than they had gained in the previous 2 weeks of fighting. The hedgerow country was behind them now, and ahead lay the open terrain of central France, where the Sherman's mobility and reliability would finally come into play. But the cost of breaking out of Normandy had been staggering. The 3rd Armored Division had lost over 200 Sherman tanks and nearly 1,000 men in 6 weeks of combat. They had started with 232 Sherman tanks on D-Day. They had received 176 replacement tanks during the campaign, and they still had only 131 operational tanks at the end of July. The arithmetic was inescapable. They had lost more tanks than they had started with, and the campaign was far from over. Ahead lay the Falaise Pocket, the race across France, the Siegfried Line, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final drive into Germany. Each battle would claim its toll of Sherman tanks and their crews. By the end of the war in Europe, the United States would lose over 6,000 Sherman tanks in combat, and with them, tens of thousands of American tankers would be killed or wounded. On August 1, 1944, as the 3rd Armored Division raced through the French countryside in pursuit of the retreating Germans, Knudsen received a letter from home. Betty Lou had written to tell him she had taken a job at the ammunition plant in Des Moines, making 75mm shells for Sherman tanks. She was proud to be doing her part for the war effort, she wrote, helping to give American boys the tools they needed to win. Knudsen folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to the picture of Betty Lou he had carried since leaving the States. He didn't have the heart to tell her that the shells she was making would bounce harmlessly off the armor of German tanks, that the Sherman tanks she was helping to arm were death traps, that the boys she thought she was helping were burning alive in their tanks all across France. The liberation of France continued through August and September 1944. The Sherman tanks of the 3rd Armored Division raced across the countryside, covering distances in days that had taken months in the hedgerows. This was the kind of warfare the Sherman had been designed for: rapid advances, exploitation of breakthroughs, pursuit of a defeated enemy. The tank's reliability became its greatest asset. While German Panthers and Tigers broke down every 100 miles and required extensive maintenance, the Sherman tanks kept rolling. Their rubber block tracks might wear out quickly, but they could be replaced in the field. Their engines might be gasoline instead of diesel, but gasoline was plentiful in the Allied supply system. But even in the pursuit across France, the Sherman's weaknesses remained fatal. Small groups of German tanks, fighting desperate rearguard actions, could still exact a terrible toll. A single Panther tank, positioned at a crossroads or bridge, could destroy 4 or 5 Sherman tanks before being overwhelmed. The German tank crews had become experts at maximizing their technological advantages, using terrain and concealment to ambush the advancing Americans. They knew that, in a stand-up fight, they could destroy Sherman tanks at ranges where the American guns couldn't even scratch their paint. On August 19th, near the town of Chambois, Knudsen's tank was part of the force closing the Falaise Pocket, the trap that would destroy the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The retreating Germans were desperate to escape, and they threw everything they had at the American blocking positions. Tiger tanks of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion led the attack, their massive 88mm guns destroying Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Knudsen watched helplessly as Sherman after Sherman burst into flames, their crews having no chance against the heavily armored Tigers. The battle for the Falaise Pocket became a slaughter on both sides. The Germans lost over 10,000 killed and 50,000 captured, along with hundreds of tanks and vehicles. But the Americans paid a price too. The 3rd Armored Division lost 38 Sherman tanks closing the pocket, each one representing 5 American lives lost or forever changed. The fields around Chambois became a graveyard of military equipment, the burned-out hulls of tanks from both sides testament to the ferocity of the fighting. It was during the battle for Chambois that Knudsen witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A Sherman tank from his company, commanded by Sergeant Robert Davis from Texas, was hit by a Tiger at long range. The 88mm shell penetrated the turret, killing the gunner instantly and setting the tank on fire. Davis and his loader managed to bail out, but the driver and assistant driver were trapped in their positions by jammed hatches. Knudsen and his crew could hear them screaming over the radio, begging for help as the flames consumed them. There was nothing anyone could do. The Sherman was in the open, under direct fire from German positions. Any attempt at rescue would have been suicide. For 4 minutes, the screaming continued over the radio net until someone finally switched off the frequency. The 2 men burned alive in their Sherman tank while their comrades listened helplessly. By September 1944, the 3rd Armored Division had reached the German border. They had liberated countless French towns and villages, and the French people had welcomed them as heroes. But the tank crews knew the truth. They weren't heroes, they were survivors. They had survived the hedgerows, survived the breakout, survived the pursuit across France. But ahead lay the Siegfried Line, the fortified German border with its dragon's teeth tank obstacles, concrete bunkers, and carefully positioned anti-tank guns. Beyond that lay Germany itself, where the Wehrmacht would fight with the desperation of men defending their homeland. The Sherman tank crews had learned to adapt their tactics to maximize their chances of survival. They never advanced alone if they could help it, always moving in groups of 4 or 5 tanks to overwhelm individual German vehicles. They learned to use their superior numbers and the artillery support to suppress German positions before advancing. They learned to call in air strikes at the first sign of German armor. But most of all, they learned to accept that death could come at any moment, that their Sherman tank could become their funeral pyre with no warning. In mid-September, near the German town of Stahlberg, Knudsen's luck finally ran out. His platoon was advancing through a forest when they were ambushed by a company of Panther tanks from the 9th Panzer Division. The first indication of trouble was when the lead Sherman simply exploded, hit by multiple 75mm shells simultaneously. Knudsen ordered his driver to reverse, but it was too late. A Panther had worked around their flank and fired into their side armor at point-blank range. The shell entered just behind the turret, passing through the ammunition storage and into the engine compartment. The Sherman didn't burn this time. It simply died. The engine seized, the electrical system failed, and toxic smoke filled the crew compartment. Knudsen ordered the crew to bail out, but as he pushed open his hatch, machine gun fire from the German infantry supporting the Panthers forced him back inside. They were trapped in a dead tank, surrounded by Germans, with no way out. For 3 hours, Knudsen and his crew sat in their dead Sherman tank while the battle raged around them. German infantry tried twice to approach the tank to plant demolition charges, but Morrison and Johnson drove them back with the bow machine gun, which still had manual controls. Stevens used the manual turret traverse to slowly rotate the turret, making the Germans think the tank was still operational. It was a desperate bluff, but it worked. The Germans decided to bypass the apparently still dangerous tank and continue their advance. As darkness fell, Knudsen and his crew finally escaped from their Sherman. They crawled through the forest for 6 hours, avoiding German patrols, until they reached American lines. They were the only survivors from their platoon. 20 Sherman tanks and 100 men had entered that forest. 4 men walked out. The rest were dead or missing, their tanks scattered through the woods like discarded toys. Knudsen never commanded a tank again. He was promoted to first sergeant and transferred to a headquarters unit, his days of armored combat over. But for thousands of other American tankers, the ordeal continued. Through the bitter winter of 1944-45, Sherman tanks fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where German Panthers and King Tigers once again proved their superiority in tank versus tank combat. In the Ardennes forest, entire companies of Sherman tanks were wiped out by single German heavy tanks. The 3rd Armored Division alone lost 125 Sherman tanks in the Battle of the Bulge, each one representing 5 American lives potentially lost. The final irony came in March 1945, when the first M26 Pershing heavy tanks finally reached the battlefield. The Pershing had a 90mm gun that could penetrate a Panther's armor at normal combat ranges. It had armor thick enough to withstand German 75mm guns. It was everything the Sherman tank crews had been begging for since Normandy. But it was too late. Only 20 Pershings saw combat in Europe before the war ended. 20 tanks to replace the thousands of Shermans that had burned, the tens of thousands of men who had died in inferior machines. After the war, Knudsen returned to Iowa and married Betty Lou. He never talked about his experiences in the war, never told her about the burning Sherman tanks, never described the sound men made when they died in their tanks. When people asked him about his service, he would simply say he had been in the 3rd Armored Division and changed the subject. But at night, in his dreams, he was back in the hedgerows of Normandy, watching Sherman tanks burn, hearing the screams of trapped men, smelling the mixture of burning gasoline and flesh that he could never forget. Years later, when his grandson asked him about the war for a school project, Knudsen finally broke his silence. He told the boy about the Sherman tank, about its strengths and weaknesses, about the men who crewed them and died in them. He explained how American industry had produced 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war, how they had overwhelmed the Germans through sheer numbers despite being individually inferior. He told him about the mathematics of tank warfare, how it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, how the first 4 would burn. But Grandpa, the boy asked. Why didn't we build better tanks if we knew the Shermans weren't good enough? Knudsen thought for a long moment before answering. We built what we could build, shipped what we could ship, and fought with what we had. The Sherman tank wasn't the best tank of the war, but it was the tank that won the war. It won because there were so many of them, because they kept running when German tanks broke down, because brave men kept climbing into them even though they knew the odds. The Sherman tank was a compromise, and compromises in war are paid for in blood. The boy wrote his report and got an A. His teacher commended him for the detailed information about the Sherman tank specifications, the accurate unit designations, the specific battle locations. But what the teacher didn't understand, what the boy couldn't convey in his report, was the human cost of those compromises. Every burned-out Sherman tank in Northwest Europe represented 5 young Americans who had climbed into what they knew was an inferior machine and fought anyway. They fought because it was their duty, because their friends depended on them, because there was no other choice. The Sherman tank became the symbol of American industrial might in World War II, but for the men who fought in them, it was a symbol of something else entirely. It was a symbol of courage in the face of technological inferiority, of sacrifice despite the odds, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things in terrible machines. When people today see a Sherman tank in a museum, they see an icon of American victory. But veterans like Knudsen saw something different. They saw a steel coffin that somehow, through luck or divine intervention, they had managed to escape. The statistics tell one story. 49,000 Sherman tanks produced, 6,000 destroyed in combat. The war won. But each destroyed Sherman represented 5 men with families, dreams, and futures. Each burning tank was a telegram to a mother, a widow left to raise children alone, a family forever changed. The Sherman tank won the war, but at a cost that can never be fully calculated, never be truly understood by those who weren't there. In his final years, Knudsen would sometimes drive out to the veterans' cemetery on the edge of town. He would walk among the headstones, reading the names of men he had known, men who had died in Sherman tanks in places with names like St. Lo, Mortain, Falaise, Stahlberg, and Remagen. He would remember their faces, young faces that never had the chance to grow old, and he would think about the terrible arithmetic of war. 5 Shermans for 1 Panther. For would burn. It was always the same equation, always the same result. When William Knudsen died in 2003, his obituary mentioned his service with the 3rd Armored Division, his Bronze Star, his Purple Heart. It didn't mention the Sherman tanks he had commanded, the friends he had lost, the memories that had haunted him for 60 years. At his funeral, his grandson read a passage from a letter Knudsen had written but never sent, found among his papers after his death. We knew our tanks were no match for the German panzers. We knew that when we went into battle, most of us wouldn't come back. But we went anyway because that's what soldiers do. We climbed into those thin-skinned Shermans and faced the Panthers and Tigers because someone had to. We were the tip of the spear, the point of contact between American industrial might and German engineering excellence. And while German engineering was superior, American courage was equal to any in the world. We proved that in the hedgerows of Normandy, where Sherman tanks burned but kept coming, where men died but the advance continued, where inferior machines were driven by superior men. That was our victory. Not that our tanks were better, but that we were brave enough to fight in tanks we knew were worse. The legacy of the Sherman tank and the men who fought in them is complex and contradictory. It is a story of industrial triumph and technological failure, of mass production and individual sacrifice, of victory achieved through accepting terrible losses. The Sherman tank helped win World War II, but every veteran who survived combat in one knew the true cost of that victory. They had seen their friends burn alive in tanks that were never good enough, and they carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Today, Sherman tanks stand as monuments in small towns across America, their guns pointing skyward, their hatches sealed forever. Children climb on them and play at war, imagining themselves as tank commanders liberating Europe. But if those tanks could speak, they would tell a different story. They would tell of young men who knew they were climbing into death traps but did it anyway. They would tell of the terrible mathematics of armored warfare, where American lives were the currency used to purchase victory. They would tell of burning tanks and screaming men, of courage despite fear, of duty despite the odds. The Sherman tank was not the best tank of World War II. It was not the most heavily armed or armored. It was not the most feared or respected. But it was the tank that was there, in overwhelming numbers, crewed by brave men who knew its limitations but fought anyway. And in the end, that was enough. The Sherman tank and its crews paid the price for victory in Europe, a price measured not in steel and aluminum but in blood and courage. They were ordinary men in inferior machines who achieved extraordinary things through sacrifice and determination. That is their story, and it deserves to be remembered not as a tale of American technical superiority, but as a testament to the courage of men who fought despite knowing the odds were against them. The Sherman tank earned many nicknames during World War II. The Germans called them Tommy Cookers, the British called them Ronsons, but the Americans who fought in them had another name, whispered in the tank parks and maintenance depots, spoken in the replacement centers where new crews arrived to take the place of the dead. They called them steel coffins. And every man who climbed into one knew that he might never climb out. Yet they climbed in anyway, started the engines, and rolled into battle. That was their courage, their sacrifice, their victory. Not that they had the best tanks, but that they had the best men. Men willing to fight in tanks they knew would burn, men willing to die in machines they knew were inferior, men who proved that courage can overcome technology, that determination can defeat engineering, that the human spirit is stronger than steel. When the last Sherman tank veteran passes away, when the last man who knew the smell of burning tanks and the sound of screaming crews is gone, we will lose something irreplaceable. We will lose the living memory of what it cost to defeat fascism, what price was paid for freedom, what sacrifice means in its most brutal and immediate form. The Sherman tank will become just another museum piece, another monument to a war that grows more distant with each passing year. But for those who were there, who saw the tanks burn and the men die, the Sherman will always be more than a machine. It will be a symbol of the terrible arithmetic of war, where victory is purchased with lives, where inferior equipment is overcome by superior courage, where ordinary men do extraordinary things because history demands it of them. That is the true legacy of the Sherman tank and the men who fought in them. Not that they won because they had the best equipment, but that they won despite not having it. They won because they kept climbing into tanks they knew would burn. They won because they kept advancing when logic said to retreat. They won because they were Americans, and Americans don't quit even when the odds are 5-1 against them, even when their tanks are inferior, even when they know that 4 will burn so that 1 might survive. That is their story, their sacrifice, their eternal honor.